The family suggested I do a bell this year as a Christmas ornament, and that seemed like a good thing to do on the lathe. So my wife thought I should do a plaid pattern on a bell, and I sketched through this, doing a plaid pattern in wood, also as a circular shape on the lathe, was going to take more patience than I had. And I had wanted to use the CNC machine in segmented wood turning to help make the pieces to be turned on the lathe. So the first thought was to cut something into each piece and make a pattern that way. But the bell was going to be too small for that. So I moved on from that idea. Then I thought maybe I could do something with the seams between the segmented pieces. And that was starting to seem promising, like something like a Christmas tree shape. What I ended up with was doing a curvy shape that would be horizontal to the bell, and it would run around the full circumference of the shape. The vision I had was to do a snowy ground with snowflakes in the air above that ground, which worked well because the snowy ground could be sort of curvy and not have any sharp points. So the first thing I did was to run a test of my curvy line between two different pieces of material. What I figured out from the test was that I needed better hold downs. So I stopped and made a set of proper hold downs so I cut the slot for the bolt for the hold downs with the router, and then I cut the rest of them just with the radial arm saws. This seemed faster than doing the whole thing on the CNC machine. So with hold downs, the force is really side to side and not up and down so much. So you really want something that has a little bit of a corner to it, so you can hold down a little bit, but you can push on the sides of your work material. Now with those made, I could start working on my actual pieces of wood. And what I decided to do was to use Purple Heart for the sky, birch for the snow. I had thought I would use maple, but I couldn't find small maple dowels. I used birch because that's what I could find. So I cut the first piece, and I made this cut by drawing a wavy line. On one piece of wood, I offset the cut to one side, and then on the other piece of wood, I offset it to the other side so that I would get the radiuses on the curves to match up. The radiuses on the line aren't any smaller than 3/8 of an inch, which is the size of the router bit. And my new hold downs worked really well. And the pieces fit together perfectly on the first try, which I was amazed with. Jointed the pieces just to get the cut a little smoother on the bottom surface. Then it was just a matter of gluing them together. And it's a little more work than just a straight joint because you have to get the glue into every little bump. But it wasn't too bad. And then just some clamps and let that glue set up. And then once the glue's set up, I can take the clamps off. And the birch piece was just a hair thicker, so I face jointed one side of the finished piece. And then the birch was a little wider than I needed to, so I cut that down. Now for the shape of the segments, I did a quick model of a 6-sided cone. And the thought was to not build up the segments in rings, but to just make one big wide ring for the bell shape, and then find the shape of the bell in that cone. So it meant cutting a compound angle on each of the sides. And it actually worked really well. I could flip my workpiece around between each cut, and then they would all go together. So that was my test piece, and then I did it on my final piece. It's one of those things where you're afraid of ruining the work you've done so far, so you're a little too cautious, and you really just need to dive into it. Now, one of the things that I knew was going to be an issue was getting that wavy pattern to stay lined up as it goes around the circumference of the bell. So I tried to cut them in the same place in that pattern. And a few of them ended up working, and a few of them ended up not being aligned. And I still haven't really figured out how that wavy line is working within the cone as it's being turned. What happens to that point where the pieces connect. Then I could dry fit them together. And they seem to go together pretty well. And once it was together, I could draw where I wanted the snowflakes in the purple heart. And I numbered them. Not that it really mattered that much. And then I could take that apart and go over to the drill press. This could be done on the CNC as well, but it was quicker just to do it on the drill press, as it's just a random pattern. So I had 3 different sizes of dowels, and I had 3 different sizes of drill bits to make the holes. So I got the dowels, and I cut them into little short segments. This method kind of works. There must be a better way to cut little pieces off of dowels. And then it was just a matter of gluing pegs into the holes. It turned out that the largest size went in and the smallest size, with the middle size was a little tight, so I ended up having to find a different drill bit to make those fit, but they worked in the end. Then I could glue together the segments. Now my angles when I cut them were really close, but not quite close enough to get every seam all the way around to be perfectly tight. So I glued up each half and then put a little shim between the halves to take up that error. And then once the 2 halves were glued, I could then sand the faces of the 2 halves and get them to go together perfectly. And I can check to see how flat they are as I'm going. Once they go together perfectly, I can then just glue the 2 halves together. And then things got a little weird.
Exterminate! Exterminate! Exterminate!
Yeah. So the angle on the cone, I was still able to use the hose clamps and have them not come off. I think if it had been a steeper angle, that may not have worked. And then once the glue is dry on that, I can take the clamps off and it's ready to be turned. So I can put it on the lathe. The regular jaws that I have didn't quite fit the wide end of the piece, so I had to use my big plate jaws. Don't really hold as well. So this first part of turning is really to make a tenon to go in my smaller steel jaws at the small end of the shape. Once that's made, I can turn the piece around and pull the big jaws off and put the little ones on. And then it's held in place much, much better. And I'll do most of the work at the bottom end of the bell when it's set up like this. I found the birch was a lot easier to turn than the Purple Heart, so I can get the basic shape going at this point. And then clean up the end. And there was actually still too much of the birch at the bottom, so I shortened up the bottom of the bell. It's sort of tricky through here because I sort of knew in my mind the shape and how I wanted it to work, but each step doesn't get you the full way there, so you have to kind of guess the form that you're making. Like I wasn't exactly sure how much of the birch to take off, but it kind of felt about right. Then working back and forth from the inside and the outside to kind of get the shape right of the bell. I was getting it somewhat close at this point, and what I wanted to do was to add a few more snowflakes. When I drilled the holes on the drill press with the pieces separated, I couldn't get too close to the edge because I didn't want to drill into the angled cut. So the way the snowflakes are now, they're sort of in the center of each segment. So I wanted to add a few more snowflakes along the seams of the segments. So I just drilled some more holes and I put in some more pegs. And to keep it simple, I just used the smallest peg size. So I wasn't changing drill bits and I wasn't going back and forth with different size pegs. For the most part without a hammer. So I could just push them in with my fingers. Then once they were dry, I could just cut off the little bit of extra. And then just keep turning on the form and finalizing the shape. I wanted a nice sweeping, graceful flare at the bottom of the bell. So that's what I was going for. With a single curve, without any sort of bumps or sort of trim pieces or things that would break that smooth curve. And then once I had the form, I could then just sand. And it's a small piece, so the sanding goes pretty quickly. And you can start to see a little bit where the pattern doesn't line up perfectly. But I think that's okay. Then I can turn the whole piece around and work on the top of the bell. If this were a bowl, this would be the bottom piece and I'd be doing the foot. But this is a bell, so it'll be upside down, sort of. So this is the top. And I can get that shape fairly close. Now, it was at about this point where I was beginning to realize I didn't really have a way to hang the bell or to hang the little knocker on the inside. So what I came up with was to try and drill a hole into the top and clean up the inside of the segments. That didn't work at first, but it was because my top surface wasn't real flat, so I cleaned that up. And then I went really slowly with the drill bit, and I got a nice, clean, big hole into the top of the bell. This was a little nerve-wracking because I didn't want it to catch and the whole thing to come flying apart and all the work done so far lost. I managed to get a nice, big, clean hole, and it was actually really well centered. I was lucky. So then the thought was to make a plug that'll fit in that hole. And the bottom of that plug will be a hook to hold the knocker. And then the top of that plug will be the spot to hang the bell from. I didn't really want to do a cap or sort of a separate piece or a different colored wood or something like that. I wanted something to feel like it was part of the same form. I glued up some scrap pieces of purple heart that I had, and I could start working on that plug. I needed the diameter that I was working towards, and I've made a cylinder to that diameter, which isn't too hard, but it's finicky because you can't take off too much or you have to start over. My first check, and it was a little too tight. So I did this 3 or 4 times where I'd take off a little bit and then check it, and take off a little bit and check it. But at some point, it has to get to a place where it fits. And then once I had a spot where it would fit, I could then start to carve and make the form that I was going after. So I made a ball where the ribbon could go through to hang the bell, and then just a pointy bit above that. And that'll fit in that hole, just like that. The unturned end I needed to cut off, and I started at the radial arm saw because it'd give me a nice clean cut, but I didn't feel like I had the support I needed, and that was going to be dangerous, so I used the bandsaw. The cut end on this isn't really going to be seen, so it really doesn't have to be that nice. I put a hole in that cut end and put an eye hook in there. That'll be where the knocker will hang from, so that'll go into the hole, and then the ball will stick out. And I used the lathe to glue it up as it would hold it nice and straight. Wouldn't be lopsided or crooked. And then once the glue had set up, I could then turn the plug and the bell shape together so that they would be one curve, one shape. And this I did real slow and really carefully because I didn't have any support at the end of the piece. And I didn't want it to catch and come flying off. But it worked okay. Then I could sand. Now the bell part is basically done. Now I can make the knocker. And I realized as I was turning this, the top I had made on the bell was a little bit of a ball shape, like the knocker. So I thought it'd be kind of nice to have the form at the top of the bell be repeated in the form sticking out of the bottom of the bell. So I did sort of the same ball shape with a little pointer sticking out of it. In doing this long form, I did the ball and the pointy bit first, and I got that pretty well finished because I didn't want to be working on that out at the end of a long skinny rod. So I got that part finished. Then I worked on the long skinny part of the knocker, so sort of the part that lets the ball hang in space. And then from there, I just had to figure out how long to make it so it would hang in the right place. That was fairly straightforward. And I could part that off. And I cut it most of the way through, and then I cut the rest of it on the bandsaw. I didn't want the knocker to go flying across the shop. Now for the hook that goes in the end of the knocker, I cut off a piece of an eye hook so I could have a actual hook. So I could just put the knocker up inside the bell and have it just hang there. And it works. It doesn't really sound like much, but it works. I needed the hole for the ribbon so the bell could be hung. So I drilled a hole for that. Then it just needed finish. I'm just using butcher block finish on this. And the knocker can go in. And it came out really nice. And then the ribbon can go in.
Merry Christmas to all!
Thanks for watching.